ability to generate awareness around the globe about the importance of living within natural boundaries and the importance of understanding that we as human beings are dependent on ecosystems for our survival, but also for our prosperity. And so it's a timely reminder of that and a wake-up call for us to take much greater care of biodiversity and ecosystem services.
Let me start with congratulating you and those in your field, because you have brought awareness not only to, obviously, government officials, but also to corporate America and around the world for that matter. Despite that, what more needs to be done?
What we need to do is to move beyond raising awareness and to catalyze people to act. And I think you do that by making these issues more real to their daily lives, by which I mean transitioning the conversation away from environment and what climate change, for example, means for polar bears and melting ice caps, and instead to speak about it as it impacts human lives, how it impacts livelihoods, how it affects where you can live, how it impacts the realization of your human rights, how it interfaces with your health, how it is heavily dependent on your overall prosperity, how it relates to your children's future. So I think we need to catalyze greater action, and I think we start by changing the discourse. But we also need to try and equip people to do the right thing and not just demand that they do the right thing. So now over the coming years, I think the challenge is for us to provide them with the tools, and then I think we'll see results.
And them, I'm partially suggesting corporations as well. Companies like Weyerhaeuser that are planting millions of trees in areas that were deforested. Yes, there are some good examples, but how do you reach the other 90+% of companies who may not see where their role is in terms of protecting the environment, or for that matter, making it a more sustainable environment?
Well, I think where we have begun is we have begun with essentially 3 issues. We try to communicate risk, we try to communicate opportunity, and we try to communicate demand. And what I mean by those is that many companies, and I would make this comment for other segments of society, including governments, but many companies don't truly understand their exposure to risk. They don't understand that climate change, for example, has impacts on their supply chains, has impacts on the fundamental resources they use for production, can in an instant, through an extreme weather event, destroy their infrastructure, their utilities, their installations.
You're talking about their business itself, the viability
business
of
risk.
their business, but what about what customers want? If I'm a customer of your business and I say, I want to be green, and I'm demanding your products be green, or your services not have an adverse impact on the environment. Do they hear that?
They do, and I would consider that also a risk vector, because increasingly we're seeing, for example, reputational risk occurring as a consequence of companies not making the transition to a more environmentally friendly stance. We're seeing reputational benefit moving towards those companies who are seen to be green, and we're also seeing the same on the investor side of things. Investors are now much more conscious of these issues, whether it's philanthropies and universities deciding where they're going to place their endowments, or mainstream investors deciding what types of bets they want to make. So we're seeing that reputational risk. And then there's a third element of risk, of course, which is increasing regulatory risk. Consumers are not only people who shop, consumers are also people who vote. And increasingly, they're placing their bets, their own votes, and putting in place a policy-enabling environment for environmental protection that was certainly not there when I was born in the 70s and is increasing over time.
You bring up a good point. Yes, companies can do stuff, but so can governments, right? I know many cities around this country that have banned plastic bags, for example, and that was very controversial at first, and now they're using paper bags, and now people bring their own bags. But policies similar to that, why do we not see perhaps more of it? Or maybe there's a lot in the pipeline.
I think, first of all, there is a lot in the pipeline. If you look at something like climate change again, there are now 96 countries around the world who have domestic climate policies. There are more than 40 jurisdictions around the world, national and subnational, that have a price on carbon. There are 196 countries who will gather in Paris at the end of this year, and together they will sign an unprecedented global deal on climate.
You're optimistic then?
I'm optimistic. They will bind 196 countries together to commit to long-term climate action. So there is a lot going on, and I think it's a positive development because business basically needs 2 things to act. It needs certainty and it needs incentives.
What more can governments do to push that forward?
So I think when it comes to energy, it's not just about the mix of energy we use, whether renewables or fossils. It's also about the way in which we transmit the energy. It's also about the way in which we use or conserve energy. And one of the things governments could really do, which is very important, is to update the energy grid and the energy infrastructure so that far less energy is wasted in transmission. Another thing that they ought to do is incentivize energy conservation and energy efficiency, because many of my colleagues in this community are talking about energy efficiency as, if you like, the missing energy source that isn't debated nearly enough. But there are a lot of savings to be made by putting in place energy efficiency measures in factories and homes. And then, of course, another energy dimension which is often overlooked is land use planning. And the fact that if we have denser cities and better public transport, that obviously puts a lot less stress on the types of mobility that are high in fossil fuel use, such as private vehicles, etc. So there's an awful lot that we can do out there, and I think it's really about conveying the message that this is not about looking for a silver bullet. It's about thinking through a broad menu of options that we have. And if we begin to draw down from that menu of options, we'll actually find that we can get to serious climate ambition in a way that is pragmatic, in a way that is practical and manageable, and also cost efficient.